It was New Year's Eve in Chicago, and the wind off Lake Michigan cut straight through bone and pride alike. I was standing on the stone stoop of our historic Gold Coast brownstone, still trying to regain my balance after my father, Richard, had physically shoved me out the front door. My suitcase followed a second later, crashing into a snowbank beside me. "Get out before I call the cops!" he screamed from inside. Through the open doorway, I caught one last glimpse of the dining room. My brother Jordan was slow clapping. A smug smile stretched across his face as he held the vintage champagne I had bought just hours earlier. The same champagne he hadn't paid a cent for. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I simply adjusted my coat, smiled coldly and whispered, almost cheerfully, "Happy New Year." 2 hours later, that same street would be flooded with flashing blue police lights. And no, they weren't there for me. They were there for the people inside that house. Before I tell you how that happened, let me ask you something. If your own family threw you out into the snow on New Year's Eve, would you walk away forever? Or would you play the ace card you've been hiding for years? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. I was sitting in my car, parked 3 houses down from the brownstone. The engine hummed softly, the heater fighting the Chicago freeze, but my hands were still cold. Not from the weather. I wasn't looking at the house as a daughter who had just been disowned. I was looking at it as a forensic accountant staring at a crime scene. I opened my laptop. The blue glow of the screen filled the dark cabin, illuminating a spreadsheet that had been my secret companion for 8 years. I called it the Ledger of Silence. Most people think financial abuse is loud. Stolen credit cards, drained savings accounts, dramatic confrontations. In my family, abuse was quiet. It was transactional. It was a subscription fee I paid for the privilege of being tolerated. I scrolled. January 2017. $6,000 sent to my father, Richard. Property taxes are killing me. August 2018. $40,000 wire transfer for my mother's emergency medical procedure. She told me it was a heart issue. 2 weeks later, she came home with a new chin and tighter eyelids. I never asked for the money back. I just logged it. Then came Jordan. My brother, the artist, the entrepreneur, the visionary who never quite saw past his own reflection. $15,000 for his failed coffee shop. $22,000 for legal fees after a bar fight he swore wasn't his fault. Endless temporary emergencies that somehow became permanent obligations. 8 years. 96 months. Total transferred. $576,000. Over $500,000 invested in people who had just thrown my suitcase into the snow. You might wonder why a woman who hunts financial fraud for a living would let herself be financially drained by her own blood. It's a fair question. The answer isn't stupidity. It's conditioning. When you grow up in a house where affection is scarce, you learn to pay for it. You learn that your value isn't intrinsic, it's useful. I didn't give them money because I thought they loved me. I gave it because I believed it was the rent I owed for taking up space in their world. They trained me to believe their cruelty was just the cost of doing business. And like a good auditor, I kept balancing the books, hoping that one day the account would settle. But sitting there in my car, watching warm yellow light spill from the windows where they were drinking my champagne, I finally understood something. The account was never going to settle. There is no number high enough to buy respect from people who see you as a resource. And resources don't have feelings. They don't have boundaries. They just get used until they're empty. I stared at the total one last time. $576,000. Not a gift. A loan they never intended to repay. And in my line of work we have a saying. The numbers never lie, but liars always mess up the numbers. I closed the laptop. The sadness was gone. In its place was something far more dangerous. Clarity. And clarity meant it was finally time to collect. To understand why I was sitting in the cold, watching my breath fog up the windshield, you have to go back exactly 60 minutes earlier, inside that dining room. It wasn't a family dinner. It was a shakedown disguised as a celebration. The room was stifling, heated to 75 degrees. My mother, Lisa, claimed it was to keep the chill of Lake Michigan from settling in her bones. The air was heavy with the scent of expensive roast beef, and the overpowering floral perfume she wore to mask the smell of gin. I was cutting into a piece of meat that cost more than my first car payment when my brother, Jordan, cleared his throat. He smiled that practiced investor's smile, a mix of boyish charm and calculated confidence. Usually it worked like magic. Tonight, however, the sweat on his brow betrayed him. "I have a small situation," he said, refilling his glass of Dom Perignon, the same bottle I had bought. "I need a bridge loan just until the quarter closes." I stopped eating. In my family, a bridge loan meant a donation disguised as a favor. "How much?" I asked calmly. $1.2 million, he said without blinking. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. My father, Richard, didn't even flinch. He kept chewing, staring at me with an expectation that made my skin crawl. This had been planned. The ambush was real. "It's for legal fees," Jordan continued quickly. "A misunderstanding with franchise partners. They're freezing my assets. I just need you to liquidate your 401k, maybe take a small equity line. I'll pay you back double in 6 months." He slid a manila envelope across the mahogany table. Most sisters would have softened at the pleading eyes of their brother. "I am a forensic accountant." I opened the folder and started reading. Less than 3 minutes later, I had the answer. There were no franchise partners. There were no restaurants. There were just transfers between shell companies, payouts to early investors using money from new investors, and a growing deficit spiraling out of control. "This isn't a legal misunderstanding, Jordan," I said, closing the folder. "This is a Ponzi scheme. You are defrauding your friends." Then the explosion happened. My father slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal jump. He rose to his full height, face flushed purple with fury. He didn't ask if Jordan was lying. He didn't ask if his son had committed a crime. He looked at me. "You're always so jealous." He spat. "Your brother is a visionary. He takes risks. You just sit in your little office counting other people's money, because you're too scared to build anything of your own. You're going to help him, Gabrielle. You'll sign those papers tonight, or you are no daughter of mine." I glanced at my mother. She studied her nails, pretending not to hear her husband demand that I bankrupt myself to save their golden child. Jordan smirked. Daddy was doing the fighting. He thought he could relax. That's when I realized. They didn't care about the fraud. They didn't care where the money came from. They only cared that the tap was running dry. "I am not giving you a dime," I said quietly. Richard pointed to the door. "Then get out. Get out of my house, and don't come back until you learn some loyalty." And that is how I ended up watching my suitcase being buried in snow outside, cold and silent, while they laughed inside. They thought they had won because they still had the house. They believed the walls around them were Richard's legacy. They had no idea that the roof over their heads was just another line item in my ledger, and I was about to close the account. By now, my phone had started vibrating against the console like a trapped insect. 12 minutes had passed since I called the police liaison on the non-emergency line. The notifications felt like gunshots. My family assumed my silence meant defeat. But the woman in that car was no victim. I picked up my phone. The first message was from my mother. Not an apology, a masterpiece of passive-aggressive manipulation. "You have ruined New Year's Eve. Your father is beside himself. Fix this before midnight, or do not bother coming back. We are a family, Gabrielle, and families forgive, but they do not forget disrespect." She spoke of forgiveness as though it were a grace she could grant, rather than asking for amnesty she had no right to demand. Then I opened Instagram. Jordan had posted a boomerang of himself popping the cork on the Dom Perignon I had bought 3 hours ago. Caption: "Cleaning out the toxic energy for 2025. #New Beginnings #Entrepreneur Life." In the background, my father laughed, flushed with triumph. The king of a kingdom he thought he still ruled. And then there was the voicemail. Richard's voice, thick with scotch and entitlement, filled the car. "Gabrielle, if you do not transfer those funds by tomorrow morning, I am calling your firm. I will tell the partners you are emotionally unstable." I will tell them you steal from family. Do not test me. I made you, and I can break you. A younger version of me would have crumbled at the tone of authority. The woman in the car now? I saw through it. Richard screamed because he needed me to be weak. He threatened because he knew, deep down he was hollow. 3 years ago, he quietly went bankrupt. He had no real financial power left. Patriarchal authority was his only currency. His aggression wasn't strength, it was panic. And I would not give him the satisfaction. I looked up at the brownstone one last time. They were dancing on the trapdoor, believing the house was theirs by birthright, their fortress against the world. They had no idea that the real shield belonged to Phoenix Holdings, and Phoenix Holdings was sitting in a Honda Civic 3 doors down, watching the clock tick toward justice. Then, in the rearview mirror I saw them. Blue lights painting the snowy street in icy kaleidoscopes. 2 patrol cars pulled up silently behind me. It was time. I closed my laptop, picked up the heavy black binder from the passenger seat, the nuclear folder, and stepped into the wind. Victory was a cold lap of reality. The officers were waiting, serious but weary. Sergeant Miller, the older one, gave me that tired, holiday domestic call look. He expected tears, a sob story about a drunken quarrel or family feud. I didn't give him the chance. I straightened my posture, lowered my voice an octave, shedding the daughter identity entirely. I became the corporate auditor, the professional in control. Officer, I said, extending my hand. I'm Gabriele. I placed the call. Thank you for coming. He nodded. We got a report of a disturbance. If this is just a family dispute, we usually suggest cooling off for the night. This is not a family dispute, I said, cutting him off with precision. This is a property dispute involving squatters violating the lease. I am requesting an escort to execute an immediate eviction. I handed him the black binder. He shined his flashlight on the first page, a deed of sale dated 3 years ago. You own this property? He asked, raising his eyebrows. Through a shell company, I explained. Phoenix Holdings. I am the sole member. 3 years ago my father, the celebrated real estate speculator, quietly went bankrupt. He leveraged the brownstone to cover failed commercial zoning projects. The bank foreclosed, preparing to sell it at public auction. The shame would have destroyed him. So I stepped in. Using money I had earned tracing hidden assets for divorce lawyers, I bought the debt. I bought the house before a single for sale sign went up. Phoenix Holdings allowed my parents to stay as caretakers under the illusion of ownership, a secret arrangement that shielded them from shame while keeping the property under my control. Look at page 4, I instructed, pointing to a highlighted section. Officer Miller flipped the page. Lease agreement. Richard and Lisa rent for $1 per year. Good conduct clause? Clear. I added clause 7b. Tenants agree that any act of verbal abuse, physical aggression, or harassment toward the landlord or landlord's agents constitutes an immediate breach of contract and forfeiture of tenancy rights. When Richard shoved me into the snow earlier, he hadn't just assaulted a daughter. He had assaulted an agent of Phoenix Holdings. He violated clause 7b. They think they own the place, the officer muttered, glancing at the house where music thumped obliviously. They think a lot of things, I said coldly. They think they are royalty. Legally, they are month-to-month tenants on an expired lease. Tonight, I am closing the building. The officer closed the binder. Professional alertness replaced fatigue. He looked from me to the house. All right, Miss Gabrielle. Let's go have a talk with your tenants. I walked toward the house, boots crunching on the frozen driveway. My mind wasn't on the eviction. It was on the secret I had never told the police. The double-dip theft. People assumed I had bought the brownstone to spite my father. Wrong. 3 years ago, while digging through the digital trash of my father's computer, I uncovered the truth. Massive wire transfers draining my parents' retirement. Hundreds of thousands funneled into a Cayman shell called J Prime Ventures. The golden child hadn't lost his own money. He had emptied our parents' pension to bankroll lease supercars and nightlife. I could have sent him to prison. But it would have destroyed my mother. Instead, I used every dollar I earned tracking hidden assets for Fortune 500 firms to buy the brownstone, to keep them off the street. I laundered there. Survival. Tonight, Jordan attempted to steal again. This time, by mortgaging my property to cover his collapsing Ponzi scheme. They celebrated him while preparing to exile me. Victims worshipping their executioner. On the porch, Sergeant Miller knocked. My father opened the door, scotch in hand, smugly expecting police enforcement. Instead, Miller stepped aside. I showed the deed. Phoenix Holdings, owner, Gabrielle Royals. The scotch shattered at Richard's feet. Jordan screamed, "Theft!" I reminded him. I had purchased the house with the money I recovered from the accounts he had drained. The officers gave them 30 minutes to leave. My mother wailed. For once, I felt nothing. Only release. This was an amputation. It was surgery. I was removing a tumor that had lived rent-free in my life for decades. Later, after they were gone, I walked through the quiet house, poured out their abandoned champagne, and sat in my father's leather chair. I sent an email awarding my mentee, Elena, a full scholarship, the exact money I had been sending to my parents every month. Outside, fireworks exploded over Lake Michigan. It had taken $576,000 to learn the truth. You cannot buy respect from people who survive on your shame. The ledger of silence was closed. The locks were changed. And finally, the owner had moved in. The officers stood at the curb as Richard, Lisa, and Jordan scrambled to collect what they could carry. Their panic was almost theatrical. Suits, handbags, the last bottle of Dom Perignon. But no amount of flailing could reverse the fact. The house no longer belonged to them. I stayed on the porch, the winter wind biting my cheeks, but I felt nothing but clarity. For the first time in decades, I wasn't playing a role assigned to me by birth. I wasn't the dutiful daughter, the unpaid banker, or the silent observer. I was the owner, the executor of justice, the one in control. Sergeant Miller gave me a look that said, "All done here, ma'am." I nodded politely. No more explanations were needed. The law was on my side. The house, the symbol of my family's power over me, was mine, legitimately, legally, irrevocably. I walked through the brownstone, each room a silent witness to years of manipulation, deceit, and entitlement. Dust motes danced in the golden streams of afternoon sunlight, the same light that had previously lit their feasts and schemes. I paused in the dining room, the sight of Jordan's attempted shakedown, and ran my hand along the mahogany table. I remembered every ledger entry, every envelope, every promise I had ignored in order to protect myself from them. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about autonomy. Every step I took through the halls of the house reinforced a truth I had kept hidden for too long. I am not defined by their approval or their cruelty. The champagne they had left behind, abandoned in their hurry, sat like trophies on the sideboard. I poured it out into the sink, feeling a symbolic release. The ritual was small but profound. The liquid, once a tool of their celebration over my exile, was now nothing. Empty. I settled into my father's leather chair, the familiar scent of his presence lingering but powerless. I opened my laptop again, not to audit anyone, not to balance accounts, but to plan for the future. I drafted budgets for renovations, notes for historic preservation, and a list of tenants who would respect the house and the law. Phoenix Holdings was more than a shell company. It was a shield, a fortress, and a statement. I would protect what is mine with precision and clarity. The fireworks outside Lake Michigan reminded me that life moves forward, with or without the people who tried to hold you back. I sat back and allowed myself a moment of satisfaction. Not gloating, not revenge, just a quiet acknowledgement of a victory hard-earned and utterly deserved. And then I thought about Elena. I had just secured her scholarship with the exact funds I had been giving to my family. For decades, my generosity had been a tool of manipulation. Now it would be a tool of empowerment. I imagined her opening the email, her eyes lighting up at an opportunity she hadn't dared hope for. I smiled. Finally, my money, my effort, my strategy, they were used for good. I stood, walking through each room like a new owner exploring her domain. The walls, the floors, even the windows, Everything bore silent testimony to years of silent labor, resilience, and quiet cunning. And yet, this was only the beginning. I wasn't here to dwell on the past, I was here to redefine the future. Outside, the city carried on as usual. The lake roared, winds swept, and somewhere distant, New Year's celebrations continued. I could hear laughter from rooftops, music from cars, and the distant hum of life that had once felt unreachable to me. Now it was mine to observe, to experience, to shape. I went upstairs, walked into the master bedroom that had been my parents' sanctuary, and paused at the window. Snow still clung to the branches, a cold, white blanket over a city that never slept. I realized that this victory, this moment of total control, was not just about financial retribution. It was about self-respect, clarity, and reclaiming my life. I made a promise to myself. No more paying for affection. No more logging the abuse of others. No more letting family dynamics dictate the value of my time, my money, or my presence. This house, this ledger, this ownership, it was a metaphor for everything I had been denied and everything I had earned. And finally, as midnight faded into the first hours of the new year, I allowed a small, genuine smile. The ledger of silence was closed. The accounts balanced. And for the first time, the owner of the house was also the owner of her destiny. Outside, fireworks bloomed over Lake Michigan, brilliant and unrestrained. Inside, I poured myself a glass of untouched champagne and raised it silently. To clarity, to autonomy, and to finally moving in. The past had tried to bury me in snow, in silence, and in debt. But tonight I was standing in the warm light of my own triumph, knowing that $576,000 and years of strategy had bought me something no one could ever take away, myself.